tolerance of different perspectives, spiritual paths, and ways of knowing God has been a defining quality of our Unitarian Universalist approach to religion. But for as long as it has been a core value, there have also been struggles with and debates about its scope and its application. How tolerant do we need to be? Must we tolerate intolerance? What if something or someone is a challenge to other core values that we hold? What are the limits of tolerance? Unitarians were asking themselves these questions in the mid-19th century when a group of radical philosophers and theologians called the Transcendentalists were challenging the prevailing Unitarian ideas about how one connected with God and what were the essential elements of religion. In 1841, Theodore Parker, a Unitarian minister who you've heard us tell stories about before, preached a sermon called A Discourse on the Transient and Permanent in Christianity, in which he said that the religion that Jesus taught about love of God and of neighbor remained permanent, but that all of those theologies and doctrines and traditions and all of the trappings of church were merely transient. He challenged the purpose of church, and so, as you can imagine, the Unitarian clergy were a bit unhappy. His colleagues got together and they fretted and they said, "What are we going to do?" They spent meetings going around in circles. Parker's words were an affront to their calling and their livelihood. They asked him to withdraw from ministry, from fellowship, but he declined. In the words of historian Conrad Wright, there was no way to exclude him without abandoning the principle of free inquiry. So several members said kind things about Parker's sincerity. He burst into tears and left the room, where a colleague shook him cordially by the hand and expressed the hope that he would come to see him soon. His colleagues decided that because of Parker's views, they could not have what they called ministerial intercourse with him. However, they hoped to still have a friendly and social intercourse. Parker's colleagues essentially tried to excommunicate him for his views, but in the process, they realized that their commitment to tolerance and freedom in religion prohibited them from kicking him out. This episode in our history stretched the limits of our tolerance, this value that we hold dear. Now, Parker went on to lead the 28th Congregational Society of Boston, which, with 2,000 Sunday attendees, can you imagine, could be considered the first Unitarian megachurch. In many ways, he and his Transcendentalist friends transformed Unitarianism from within over the coming decades. Parker's contemporaries couldn't excommunicate him because tolerance and religious freedom were central to their Unitarian faith and had been for centuries. Early Unitarians in Europe had lived under threat of fines and prison and even death. It was in this climate that King John Sigismund of Transylvania issued the Edict of Torda, which was actually in 1568, 450 years ago this year. The king was a Unitarian, as Aaron said, the first and only probably in the history of the world. And this edict, which you heard earlier, declared that no one shall be compelled to believe in a certain way or should be reviled for their religion. All religions, including Unitarianism, were legally recognized, and the king insisted that all be able to practice their religion free from persecution. Now, this was very radical for the time. It was in looking back at these moments, in 1568, in 1841, and many other times and places, that 20th century Unitarian historian Earl Morris Wilbur said that Unitarianism has been characterized by freedom, reason, and tolerance. And yes, some have referred to this as our Trinity. Tolerance, Wilbur said, is important, but not an ultimate good or final aim. Tolerance is a means by which we achieve the true ends of religion, helping people to know that to know themselves as children of God, and creating religious institutions that build and embody heaven on earth. So what do we do when we encounter people or situations that challenge these ends? and challenge our commitment to tolerance. Where do we draw the line? Where can we draw the line? I ask myself these questions a lot these days about what's going on in our wider world. And I imagine you do too, because you asked us to preach about this summer. It strikes me as I look at the overlap between the questions and the topics that were voted on for this summer series. Dualistic thinking, why good things happen to bad people, how to meet people you oppose, how to deal with fear, compassion in a selfish world. It seems like we live with a lot of polarization, don't we? And we're trying to figure out how to deal with it. I promise we will also get to some lighter topics later in the summer, like friendship and soul. But when you ask about the limits of UU tolerance, what I think you're getting at is this experience of polarization and the experience of our deepest values being challenged and the struggle with the question of how open and accepting and tolerant we can be as Unitarian Universalists in these times. Is this an anything goes religion? Sometimes people ask, and my answer is an emphatic no, that's not what tolerance means or what tolerance asks of us. Tolerance, what crimes are committed in your name, writes Denise Levertov, the poet, in the poem you heard earlier. And indeed, tolerance is a word and a value and a practice that has a variety of expressions, but also a shadow side. When we lift up tolerance as a UU value, there are a few things we do not mean. Levertov is saying to her fellow poets in the midst of the Vietnam War that we must not be indifferent and call it tolerance. She names many forms of indifference in the poem: neutrality, balanced judgment, irresponsiveness. And none of these are the same as tolerance. A Benedictine nun blogger that I read recently said it this way: being tolerant is never half-hearted, never not caring. Tolerance means welcoming the stranger, whereas indifference means ignoring them. And we also see extreme individualism, bad behavior run rampant, and lack of accountability occur in the name of tolerance. The underlying belief is, I'm free to do whatever I want and you have to tolerate it. Because we all have inherent worth and dignity, as we say in UU communities. But what's missing in that is a regard for the good of others, for the inherent worth and dignity of all, and for the community. Where I draw the line is between tolerance of difference, that's one thing, and tolerance of all behavior, that's another thing. We are a religion that tolerates and celebrates all kinds of diversity and works to create a more equitable world. But we cannot be a religion that tolerates all behavior, refusing to condemn that which is truly evil and failing to confront behavior that denigrates individual and community wholeness. Levertov's poem, I think, is as resonant today as it was 40 years ago. How can we be neutral, indifferent, or irresponsive to what is happening in our country and our world right now? To immigrant families, to children, to communities of color. We cannot respond to what's happening by saying, well, it's a free country, because it's not for everyone. Have you ever been in a community that struggled with inclusion? Yeah, with people who didn't fit in, or people who acted out, or people who had different opinions or theologies or political persuasions than the majority. I imagine we've all found ourselves in some situation like that. And if so, you know the challenge of defining the limits of tolerance. Where do we turn in situations like these? Well, as a church, where we turn is to covenant. There are limits to UU tolerance, and they are defined by covenant and informed by our theology of love. Rather than being a faith whose limits are defined by creed or belief, we are a faith defined by covenant, the mutual promises and commitments that we make about how we will be with each other, which include love, respect, striving to build a world of peace and justice, and nurturing and supporting one another's spiritual growth. Commitments that you hear in our affirmation that we say every Sunday, in our 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism. And we make these commitments because the way that we are together is very important. When people engage in behavior that goes against the commitments or values of our covenant, what tolerance requires of us is not to kick them out, but to welcome them by calling them back into covenant. In 2014, First UU Church in New Orleans put this covenant into action in a very challenging way when members of Operation Save America, a fundamentalist Christian anti-abortion organization, interrupted their worship service. This is the same organization that targeted Dr. George Tiller, who was murdered for his work as an abortion provider. During a moment of silence in the service, one of the group leaders began to yell about abominations, condemning the church for their stand and their work around reproductive justice. The minister who was leading the service asked the OSA members either to stay and be respectful or to leave. Church members escorted some of the more vocal protesters out of the service, but others of the OSA members stayed and tried to engage church members afterwards in coffee hour. As this was happening, youth who were being honored that Sunday in the service began to sing, leading the congregation members to form a circle around the whole sanctuary. They literally defined the limits of tolerance for that church in that moment, both through an invitation to respectful worship and by forming a circle of singing. It wasn't about whether you were pro-choice or pro-life, but it was about how you engaged with one another in that space, in that sanctuary. They invited the people who considered intruders into covenant and set clear limits for those who could not or would not respect it. Now, there are so many less dramatic ways in which we do this again and again in our lives and in our communities. We show respect for difference and we invite respect in return. When we fully embrace difference while setting limits, we can grow as individuals and as a church community. Covenant holds differences in a way that promotes respect and wholeness. We have the opportunity here to learn from our neighbors who experience life and God differently than we do, who know a different part of the elephant, because they may know something important that we have not yet experienced. And that is why it's okay if the people in the pews next to us don't believe the same as we do. It's also why a couple of years ago, we invited a minister named Rob Schenck, a pro-life evangelical Christian minister, to speak here on this chancel, sitting right here, after a screening of the documentary Armor of Light. It's a film about Reverend Schenck's journey to develop a moral and ethical response to gun violence within the evangelical community, and also about his questioning of whether being pro-gun is consistent with being pro-life. He joined forces in his efforts with Lucy McBath, the mother of Jordan Davis, who was an unarmed Black teenager murdered in Florida, to engage in a political response to these issues. They, the two of them, found common ground, and we found common ground in our desire to address gun violence in America from a faithful perspective. And I think this is a very powerful example of tolerance in action. Being who we are, a church with a long, proud history of reproductive justice work, but also inviting in someone with very different religious views than us, with whom we shared a commitment to ending gun violence. We did not give up who we are, and he did not give up who he is, but we listened to each other and found a common commitment. Unitarian Universalist theologian Rebecca Parker reflects on tolerance and our theology of love in a way that resonates, I think, both in the context of church community, but also in personal relationships. I want to share her words with you. She writes, "In the practice of tolerance, we begin to let go of all our preset opinions, our prejudices about the other. Instead of seeing the other through the veil of our preset opinions of who they are or what their value is, we let that fog part and become more and more open to the other as a real presence. And so we begin to see the uniqueness, the particularity of each one next to us. We don't define who they are, we allow them to define to us who they are. A greater intimacy is experienced, a more vivid presence of others. There's a name for this: love. The practice of tolerance comes down to love, she says. So how do we get to a place where difference isn't threatening, where instead difference calls us to love? Writer and activist Audre Lorde, in her book Sister Outsider, rightly points out that difference is threatening in large part because even with all of our differences, we are bound up together in an interdependent web. We are all interrelated. We are different, but we are not separate. This closeness oftentimes can feel threatening. It's when we're able to celebrate our differences that our interdependence as people becomes unthreatening. Lord writes, only within that interdependency of different strengths, acknowledged and equal, can the power to seek new ways of being in the world generate, as well as the courage and sustenance to act where there are no charters. So basically, she says, difference sparks creativity. It also creates possibility. So in this moment in which we live, when difference continues to feel so threatening to many, and we struggle to define the limits of our openness and tolerance, let us look to those who came before us in our Unitarian and Unitarian Universalist traditions. We have something to learn from them about steadfast tolerance, as well as the power of covenant for building community and establishing accountability. Let us not be overtaken by fear. Let us rest firmly in our covenant and our commitments and our theology of love, defining our limits and calling one another back into covenant again and again. For from this place we can continue our living tradition of tolerance within this interdependent, interrelated web of which we are all a part. May it be so for you, for this beloved church community, and for our world. Amen.